It's a big hello and welcome to another edition of VLGA Connect. Great to have you with us, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast. Thanks to our sponsors, Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. We have another terrific edition for you today. I'll get to some news very shortly, and then I'll be joined by the Mayor of Warrnambool City Council, Blain, who's here to tell us more about a campaign that's been launched by Regional Cities Victoria. They've made a $3 billion pitch ahead of this year's state election. We'll find out more about that. And the Victorian Auditor General Andrew Greaves is here. He's recently released his report on the annual audit performance of councils. He'll give us his observations on what's working well and where there's still some room for improvement. But first, let's start the show with the latest VLGA Connect news. 3 Wyndham City councillors have called an unscheduled council meeting for Monday evening to consider a motion of no confidence in Wyndham Mayor Preet Singh. Councillor Singh is still refusing to resign despite calls from his fellow councillors, many community members and the former local government minister Nick Stakos. Councillors Robert Zatkowski, Peter Maynard and Susan McIntyre have called the meeting under the council's governance rules. Worth noting, though, even if the council passes the no confidence motion, it can't force Councillor Singh to resign the mayoralty. At the Borough of Queenscliff, the Mayor, Donny Greaves, has called out disrespect from a small number of people in the public gallery at the council's meeting this week. In a statement, Councillor Greaves said the meeting was disrupted when behaviour escalated during public question time, despite reminders about the council's governance rules. He's reiterated that verbal abuse and personal remarks towards councillors and staff will not be tolerated, and the council has a duty to keep its meetings lawful, safe and dignified. Whittlesea City Council has named its replacement for departing CEO Craig Lloyd, at least for the time being. The council's Director of Infrastructure and Environment, Debbie Wood, will take up the acting CEO position from the 21st of next month. Ms Wood has been part of the council's executive team since 2020 and previously worked at Greater Bendigo, Casey and Hobart City Councils. Greater Geelong Council has decided to close all 4 creche services at its swim, sport and leisure centres from the 1st of May. The council said the decision wasn't taken lightly and that other childcare options have become more accessible. Warrnambool Shire Council has voted against the introduction of a municipal charge to its ratings system after the proposal received overwhelming public opposition. The council has also voted to pull $428,000 from the landfill reserve to fund the state-mandated green waste bin rollout. Towong Shire Council has urged Victoria's bushfire inquiry to come to the Upper Murray, warning locals could be effectively shut out of the process. The council says public open mic sessions are set for towns hundreds of kilometres away, Alexandra being the closest. That's more than a 3.5-hour drive from Corryong. The City of Melbourne is expanding its smoke-free zones to include more popular public spaces. New areas such as the Bourke Street Mall and several high-traffic laneways will now prohibit smoking and vaping to improve air quality and public health. Benalla's much-loved Rocket Playground is now officially heritage listed, with Heritage Victoria recognising it as a rare survivor of 1960s playground design, a successful outcome for the advocacy campaign that was supported by Benalla Rural City Council and the community. And one of Melbourne's longest-serving local government figures, Pat Brown, has turned 100. Pat was a councillor and former mayor of South Melbourne, later became one of Port Phillip's first elected councillors after amalgamation. She was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in 1989, and Port Phillip Council acknowledged Pat's birthday and legacy at its meeting this week. Congratulations, Pat. That's Connect News for this week. For more on the latest of what's happening around the sector, listen to the Local Government News Roundup, brought to you by the VLGA and available wherever you listen to podcasts. Well, Regional Cities Victoria has formally launched its advocacy campaign for the state election. It's calling for a $1 billion regional fund and a $2 billion regional roads package to secure the future of regional Victoria. The campaign was launched in Geelong recently, and the chair of RCV, Blain, joins me now to tell us more. Councillor Blain, good to have you here. How have you been?
I'm going really well, Chris, and thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. Obviously, the RCV state election campaign launch caught our eye with the big $3 billion price ticket. Let's break that down. How did you arrive at the $3 billion figure?
So the $3 billion figure really comes down to two really key projects. So we need a replacement for the regional jobs and infrastructure funding that has not been renewed. So that's a $1 billion ask from regional cities Victoria. And then the $2 billion is around roads funding because 80%, 80% of, 90% of Victoria's roads are state managed roads. So they manage about 19,000 kilometres across Victoria. Currently we're seeing, there's about $973 million that's been announced as a road funding blitz just for maintenance. We're not seeing the results that we really want to see from that. So we're calling on 500 million a year over the next 4 years to
Right.
increase that road maintenance funding.
So we'll come back to roads in a moment. Let's deal with the first issue, the $1 billion ask for the regional fund. What are the types of projects that are not being delivered as a result of this fund being axed a couple of years ago or 3 years ago?
So some of the projects that we've really seen across regional Victoria that aren't being delivered now, there is no actual capacity across local government. We're in a rate capped environment, so it is a challenge to be able to deliver these projects, and there isn't actually a funding stream. So especially in sport and rec and a lot of other areas, maximum is about $500,000 is all you can apply for competitive grant funding from the state government. So projects that we've seen like the Cube in Wodonga, the Shepparton Art Gallery that were delivered, in 2020 just can't be delivered because there isn't the capacity there. And that's why we need that regional jobs and infrastructure fund, because there's so many different projects across rural and regional Victoria that really can be delivered.
Yep.
So we've got the Briley Reserve, which is, one of those projects where, it's a $15 million ask, but there are no funding streams actually available to be able to deliver that. And then, looking across so many of our other regional cities as well, they've all got these key infrastructure projects where to make the livability of their city something special, or to make it a destination to actually be able to live, we just don't have the capacity to be able to fund these things because it really is about the livability. Like regional Victoria is doing their fair share of heavy lifting. We've got the housing targets to be able to deliver, but we need the livability as well.
So I'm going to ask you about those housing targets. So this fund's needed for your capacity to deliver on those as well. There's some pretty ambitious targets there that regional cities need to meet, aren't there?
Oh, that's exactly right. So the state government's put it out across the region, across regional Victoria about the housing targets that we have to meet, and some of them you're looking at increasing population by 2050 up, 10, 15%. The only way a lot of these things can be delivered, though, it all comes down to houses on the ground. And this fund has to be able to support as well that trunk infrastructure to really be able to deliver those houses, because without that state government support, especially from a rural and regional sense, we're not going to be able to deliver that housing, and that's why we need the money.
Yeah. Let's talk about the roads component. There's nobody I know that has been driving around the state of late that doesn't come back talking about the condition of roads at the moment. That's obviously being felt acutely in regional and rural areas.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And, when it comes to, and we go back, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the free public transport, well, in rural regional areas, there isn't the option there. Cars are pretty well one of the only ways. We're also major freight hubs as well. So the $500 million, currently the $973 million that's been announced by the state government, that's enough to only maintain somewhere around 1.2 to 1.8% of the road network. So at the current funding levels, you're looking at about 100 years just to be able to maintain the network, not looking at some of the roads that we are all driving on, which are at the point where they need rebuilding.
Yeah.
And so, we want to see that increased. And that's why we've got that $500 million every year for the next 4 years to try and catch up on that maintenance. But it doesn't take away then from the extra funding that's going to be needed to be able to rebuild that infrastructure because it's been left for so long.
You've also noted that regional Victoria is doing the heavy lifting when it comes to population growth. How do you balance that growth and the sustainability with the infrastructure that's lagging? It just feels like a bit of a perfect storm, doesn't it?
Well, that's right. And what's going to end up happening is, we want to be able to work with the state from a regional cities perspective to deliver on those housing targets, to make sure that we have that livability, to make sure we have those great assets. But the only way we can do that is with state government support, and looking at it from a regional cities point of view, we've got so many, like a lot of the regional cities are service centres, not just for their city, but for the wider rural communities as well, because, they're not delivered in any other way. So we
Mm.
really need to make sure that we can support not only the growth within our cities, but also make sure those services are available in the regions, because when you're looking at living in regional Victoria, I think it's really important to be able to have the same access to services that we see in a metro setting.
I know this is an issue for Warrnambool and certainly for some other parts of the state. The availability of reliable, regular public transport services, it's really come into sharp focus just of late, hasn't it? What's the situation at the moment with the press for more train and bus services, for example, in your neck of the woods?
So with the free public transport, what we've actually seen is because they've taken away the booking system, we've seen that a lot of our services are overcrowded. And I know Warrnambool's got the issue around, we don't have capacity to be able to actually deliver on those services. We've only got 3 carriage trains. We don't have the 6 carriage trains. And I know that a lot of other regional cities, Wodonga's a really good example where they actually need more services as well. And looking across the regional cities to be able to get to them and really service the rural regional areas, what we've actually seen as well is we haven't seen any reviews in bus lines for over 15 years. So to be able to access those services at key service centres, and I've got a really good example where from Hamilton, which isn't that far from Warrnambool, there's actually families that are carpooling taxis to be able to get their kids to come to be able to access our university and access our TAFE because the bus service isn't actually there. And so, the free fares is great, and I know it's been pushed really hard as a cost of living measure, but if you can't access the services, it's not making that difference there in a rural and regional setting.
What are your local representatives of the MPs saying when you raise those issues with them?
It's something they're looking into. They've said about our train capacity, especially. They've said, well, there needs to be platform lengthening, even though we've seen it on other services where, even though they've got short platforms, they can have the longer trains. And we've been talking to DTP about bus services as well, but it's a really big push. We've got to make sure from our local members. I know our local lower house member Roma Britnell's been really on the front foot about the train service, but we've also got to be looking at the bus and those connecting services as well.
When you've been sitting around the board table at RCV talking about, what are we going to focus our attention on in this state election year, how did you arrive at a $3 billion figure? And I imagine the conversation probably included the practicalness or the realisticness of, if there's such a word, of such a figure. How likely is it you would get that sort of a commitment, I guess?
I think it's very, I think it's very likely, and that's why we're going to keep working hard and make sure that we're advocating towards it, because it's not just a figure that's plucked out of the air. To be honest, the $1 billion regional infrastructure fund figure, once you're putting in housing into it, jobs and growth and infrastructure, isn't actually a huge ask.
Mm.
And the extra 500 million a year for roads isn't a big ask either, just to be able to have safe roads to be able to use, and for regional cities to be able to have access to the services and infrastructure that is comparable to something from a metro setting. I think we do sort of feel it's a little bit of a two-tiered system at the moment, where from a metro setting, they've got a lot more access than what we have from a rural regional sense. So from these asks, it's not a lot, especially when you're looking at, 35 billion for a suburban rail loop, the tunnels.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
not a big ask from regional cities to be able to deliver those key services for $3 billion.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I read that 13,000 jobs were lost as a result of the scrapping of that regional infrastructure fund. How do your regions, um, uh, how are they positioned, I guess, to respond quickly? Should the major parties commit to this? Should this become a reality post the election in November?
Every single one of our regional cities has shovel-ready projects, and these projects, there was over 1,000 projects that were funded under the Regional Jobs and Infrastructure Fund previously. We have got shovel-ready projects. We can respond really, really quickly around this. And it not only it generates jobs, so the old Regional Jobs and Infrastructure Fund, as you said, generated over 13,000 jobs.
Mm.
It also creates training pathways and skills up our workforces in a rural regional sense that they wouldn't have the exposure to without these projects.
Thank you, Ben. Ben Blain, Chair of Regional Cities Victoria. All the best to you with your advocacy in the lead up to this state election. It's going to be a fun few months, I think.
Oh no, it is going to be a fun few months, and we'll keep working hard to make sure that regional cities are continued to be heard.
And we should just note RCV represents Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, Horsham, Latrobe, Mildura, Shepparton, Wangaratta, Warrnambool, and Wodonga. Have I missed anyone?
No, you've got them. That's all 10.
Terrific. Thank you, Ben. Great to speak with you, and thanks for coming on VLGA Connect.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, each year the sector looks to the Victorian Auditor General's office for a definitive health check on our 79 councils. And the latest report for the 2024-25 year has been tabled. And while the high-level numbers suggest a sector in surplus, the underlying data tells a more complex story of infrastructure backlogs, reporting delays, and the unique pressures that are facing our smaller rural shires. Joining us today to talk us through the findings is the Victorian Auditor General Andrew Greaves. Andrew, great to have you back on VLGA Connect.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you for this new report. There's a lot in this to digest, and that headline figure that shows 75 of our 79 councils reported a surplus this year, I believe that's a significant jump from the previous year. But your report notes that was heavily influenced, wasn't it, by the timing of Commonwealth financial assistance grants. And if we strip those away, what is the true underlying financial health of the sector looking like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we've been talking about that now for a couple of years in these annual snapshots. And I'd also draw attention to the fact that late last year, we did a much deeper dive into financial management in local government, and we were looking at financial sustainability. So I'd probably draw attention to readers to both that, I think it was an October report last year, and this most recent annual snapshot. And one of the risks of an annual snapshot, of course, is that you look at an annual result and you try to draw inferences from it. And clearly, if we're looking at the longer term financial health of the sector or of any entity, we need to take a longer term view. So we would, in this report, talk about maybe a 5-year horizon and see what's been happening over that last 5 years. And I think that's personally a better approach, is to take an average result, say for a 5-year period, rather than focus on the individual annual results. And the reason I'm labouring that is because, as you quite rightly point out, a large part of the revenue of local governments, and particularly the small shires and the large shires, more so than the metros, is government grants, the financial assistance grants, for example. And, you know, our good friends at the Accounting Standards Board determined many, many years ago that you showed revenue the day you got the grant. And it didn't matter if the grant related to the next financial year or the previous financial year. You only showed the revenue when you got the grant.
Yeah.
And now we've been commentating on that for a number of years, that it has been past practice that sometimes grants get paid in advance. I think we had a point where I think about 3/4 of grants were paid in advance, or 50%, which really makes it hard then to pick up a set of financial statements, even with this year and last year's balances in them, and work out what's going on. So we, in the report, while we still report that net result, because to me that's the headline result that everyone should be focused on, we then say, well, look, if we smooth that and if we put the grants in the year to which they pertained, you'll get a slightly different result. Right. And in fact, while it might look this year like we had a lot of surpluses, if you then take out the advance grants that related to the next year, the number of councils with those net results dropped reasonably significantly. But
yeah, so
sorry, go on. Yep.
I was just going to say, for those people who perhaps aren't as literate or understanding of the way it works, your comment about looking at a 5-year average interests me. So is that easy enough for people to do? They see this headline from the one report and you're saying it would be more helpful if they see that longer term view. Is it easy to find that?
Well, it's probably not as easy to find as it could be or should be.
Right.
We do publish, and if you go to my website where you'll find this report, we publish alongside the report a dashboard which visualises the results. And for all the different cohorts and individual councils, you can see their financial performance over that 5-year horizon. So you can see kind of the trend lines at least. Right. But more and more, I think it's about whatever council you're interested in, just looking at, say, the net result for the last 5 years and saying to yourself, well, what does it look like on average?
Yeah.
Because some years you'll have a net result positive, some years you'll have a net result negative. Over time, we want the net result to be at least break even, if not slightly positive. So
Yeah.
that's the thing I'd focus on.
That makes sense. Audit.vic.gov.au is that website that you're talking about. Now, you've highlighted a growing sustainability risk for smaller councils, some of them potentially facing what you call structural deficits. What are the red flags here that you're seeing in those smaller municipalities that might be differing from their metropolitan counterparts?
Well, the idea of a structural deficit is that your current revenue and expenditure policies are leading to recurrent operating deficits. So in other words, the way you're structured, the way you're financed, and the way you're spending money, you're spending more than you're getting in. And that leads to the structural deficit. And it's complicated. It's a bit more complicated in local government and a bit more nuanced, because it's not just the recurrent operations, but it's also the capital expenditure. And what we find, of course, and we found, and we might talk about capital works a bit later, we find that a lot of councils are reluctant to get into debt to fund capital works. So they try to fund capital works from their recurrent operations, from their recurrent net operating cash flows. And so over time, you'll see that do these small shire councils in particular generate enough net operating cash flows or even operating surpluses to fund their asset renewal and their asset replacement? So the red flags for me, quite simply, are first the headline result. What are their net results looking like? Smooth that out for the movement in the grants, and then their net results look a little bit worse.
Yeah.
And then take underneath that what we call the adjusted underlying result, where we strip out the capital grants, and then they look even worse. So this headline indicator of the net result, measured three different ways, but really telling you the same story, is that they're now starting to suffer deficits and more persistent deficits than they have in the past. You know, if I reflect, you know, I came here in 2003, and at one level you could say, well, look, financial sustainability in local government's not an issue, because the councils have been operating, you know, in that period that I've been here, 23 years, and on average they've been generating surpluses, and on average their cash balances are increasing. Now that's an average for the sector. But what we're saying, I think, in this report, and more so this year, and in the other report we tabled late last year, is those smallest shires are now starting to show some signs of distress, and they're now starting to, if you like, eat into their cash reserves, and or not funding their asset renewal to the level that they should be. So they're kind of the red flags.
You made that comment about a reluctance to take on debt at some councils. I do recall in the early days of the rate capping system that came in, there was I guess it was a criticism of that it was almost designed to push councils to take on more debt. It doesn't sound like that's what's actually occurred, Andrew. Is that fair?
No, I guess that's fair. I mean, you know, as Auditor General, I can't question the merits of policy decisions by local governments or state governments. So that is the revenue and expenditure policy of the council. So be it. The point I would make about debt and deficit is that most councils, and when we looked at their long-term financial plans in the other audit that we tabled last year, most councils, obviously, well, all councils would eschew using debt for recurrent operations. That's kind of goes without saying. You wouldn't want to actually finance your recurrent operations using debt. So they focus on potentially using debt to finance their capital, but most of it's for new capital acquisitions. But that's not the norm. The norm we found in local government is that the councils seem to set budgets and finance their capital spend from what's left over after their current operations. So their net operating cash flows and their net results, they're using that, and that's almost constraining how much they're budgeting for and spending on capital renewal, capital additions. Now, the policy issue, if you like, and as I said, I'm not questioning the merit of this. The policy issue is always the issue of intergenerational debt and equity.
Yeah.
Because what this means in the current situation is that current ratepayers and past ratepayers are paying for new assets that will be enjoyed by future ratepayers. Yes. And so there is a strong argument that those future ratepayers should pay for that new asset. And the way you do that is through debt, and then you repay the debt over the period of the life of the asset.
Sat through that discussion many times, Andrew.
Yes.
Not always easy to get across the line with politically motivated
true,
representatives.
And potentially ratepayers and residents that don't understand it.
Yeah, very true.
And so they will be they'll want to very conservative. I guess is the way I put it.
In terms
exactly. Of making sure I've got the cash, but then this can work against councils because someone outside the local government sector, and the state government can look down and say, well, look, your cash reserves are growing. Why are your cash reserves growing?
And that's exactly what happens, and it's a really complex issue to explain to people. There's so much more in this report, Andrew. I would like to move on to talk about capital, which you raised there a moment ago. Pretty striking figure here of an $820 million underspend. Now, we know about the rising costs of construction and materials. So is this simply about a wait-and-see approach to budgeting, or is there a deeper delivery crisis happening here in the sector, do you think?
I wouldn't characterise it as a wait-and-see. In fact, with the rising costs, you'd expect them to be overspending on their budgets. So it is quite hard. We've called it out in both reports, about the issue of capital underspends, and these are serial. These happen continuously and have happened for a number of years. And we're trying to say to councils, well, you can best identify and diagnose why you're underspending. In my experience, and I can't give an answer for all councils, but in my experience in state and local government, sometimes the first thing is that the budgeting's not right anyway. I haven't actually got the budget struck well. I haven't formed the budget realistically. And so I might overspend or underspend the budget. And so when we talk about an underspend, is it really that I've over budgeted rather than underspent? That could be one of the answers, but I suspect not. I suspect that the budgeting, as I said, is being driven sometimes top down by how much cash they think they've got, how much free cash they've got to spend on assets, and then they're not delivering against the capital works program. I think it's very... go on.
And also perhaps political pressures to get certain big ticket items in the budget when perhaps the reality is it's going to be challenging to deliver all those commitments in a particular year.
Well, of course, we talk about shovel ready. I remember when I first came down here, and a lot of the delay in striking the budget and getting the budget signed off and approved, and councils were reluctant to actually start their capital works program until the budget had been signed off, and it was later within the financial year before they had certainty that they'd actually commit. So they didn't have a lot of shovel ready projects, and they didn't start spending on the 1st of July. They started spending in October. So I think there's a whole lot to unpack there, but certainly something that council should be looking at because of this issue of the renewal gaps and whether or not councils are sustaining and maintaining their asset base. If you're serially underspending and if your budgets are struck properly, then what you're telling me is you're really kicking the can down the road and you're going to get an issue later on in terms of your asset base.
Yeah. All right. More than half of councils, Andrew, missed their reporting deadlines for the draft financial reports, and you've mentioned a noticeable increase in errors. What's going on here, do you think?
Yeah, that's also, I don't like to generalise, but if I were to kind of look at some of the common issues that we find, we talk about, good practice in financial reporting and, that you try to get a shell set of accounts done earlier, even before balance date. You try to have all your valuations done before 30 June so the auditors can sign them off. You have someone internally quality check and quality review your work before it goes up through for approval to then give to the auditors. Now, that doesn't always happen. And, I can see, councils are constrained, they're resource constrained. So there's a capacity issue there, I think. And there's to some extent a capability issue. I don't think it's about the accounting standards necessarily getting more complicated or the financial reporting requirements getting more complicated. Although this year we did have some extra information on about the valuation of assets, which made us all step back and think about whether or not we've been valuing assets correctly. And that caused some blips both within the local government sector and the state government sector in terms of trying to get those numbers right. But yeah, it's hard to pin it down. I suspect, so it's a suspicion, it's about capacity and capability within those councils to deliver that against all their competing priorities and everything else that's going on.
Yeah, that is a real issue, I'm sure. And also a lot of high risk internal control weaknesses that have been previously identified are remaining unresolved.
Yeah.
Is this a case where audit and risk committees could be playing a stronger role perhaps to see these matters addressed?
Oh, look, front and centre, I think that is one of the key roles of the Audit and Risk Committee. I mean, they oversight internal audit and external audit, and they should pay as much regard to the external audit recommendations and the implementation of our recommendations. Now, I mean, I track, when I do performance audits in local government, I track the recommendations I make, and I track councils implementing those recommendations and publish the results on my website. With financial audit, we talk about it in this report about unresolved recommendations. The thing that concerns me most about these is that these internal control weaknesses, and here we're talking about internal controls that relate to producing reliable financial information, but also more broadly to make sure that your information is protected, and that's not disclosed inappropriately. So there's a lot of controls around information management, and a lot of our findings and repeat findings are in this space. We talk about IT controls, access controls, who can access your financial systems and your information systems. So they're quite significant findings, and the fact that they're not addressing them quickly is of concern. Now, sometimes, it requires something to do with the functionality of their systems, and they've got to wait for the vendor, if you like, to catch up. But there's a lot more that could be done, and I think you're right. I think the audit and risk committees should be at their quarterly meetings tracking how the councils are going, implementing the external and internal audit recommendations in this space.
The asset values across the sector have jumped by $12 billion. It's a staggering number. Most of that, I think, is due to revaluations. What does this, for want of a better term, paper wealth sort of mean for councillors or CEOs in the way they think about asset management, Andrew?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? When I came down here and the debate was about whether we'd bring land under roads onto the balance sheet. And, I'd come from Queensland where they had about $50 billion worth of land under roads on the balance sheet. And I said, well, how useful is that information to anybody, really?
Yeah.
It's a road. There's a road sitting on it. You're never going to access the land under it. And so people can say, look, this is just a paper exercise. We're just valuing these assets. But the way we value the assets is the key in local government, and basically the way we value all social assets in state and local government. We talk about fair value, but what we're actually talking about is what we call the current replacement cost of the asset. So there's no market for a road, but how much would it cost me to rebuild that road today, adjusted for its remaining useful life? That's a really important price signal. Because if I know what the current cost of that is, I kind of get a better sense of what the current cost of my service delivery is, and then I can compare my revenue policy to my expenditure policy. So it's a price signal to councillors that if the asset values jumped 12 billion, what that means is the cost to replace the assets has jumped 12 billion.
Yeah.
Now, if they're 50 or 70 year assets, well, that's not 12 billion in 1 year. But spread out over 50 or 70 years, it's another 12 billion they'll need to spend to replace the assets. So that's the way you'd be thinking about this, is what's it telling me about the current cost of my service delivery, and what's it telling me about how I need to adjust my revenue policies to make sure I'm covering those costs.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, Andrew, it is right now budget cycle time for councils, and councillors sitting down with executive teams talking about how that's all going to play out. Is there a particular metric or finding in your report that you think should be front and centre in those conversations that councillors are having with their executive teams?
Well, again, I'll refer to the earlier report because I think that took a deeper dive into the financial management practices of councils. And the thing that I think the main finding there was that councils are now striking their 4-year plans and their 10-year plans, and they've got their 10-year asset plan and their 10-year financial plan. We saw examples, and we only did a deep dive into 5 councils, but I suspect this would be the case across many, we saw examples where these things weren't coordinated. In fact, numbers in the asset plan were inconsistent with numbers in the financial plan. Now, if you're going to be looking at, in terms of your annual budget cycle, really your annual budget cycle needs to be framed around a longer-term strategic plan. So for me, we should be starting with our 10-year plan, trying to understand what our financial metrics need to be in 10 years and working back, if you like, to the annual budget. So rather than doing a bottom-up budget, let's start with a top-down strategic budget. Let's get our 10-year plans and our 4-year plans aligned to then inform our annual budget. That kind of takes away this kind of annual debate about what are we going to spend this year. It should be framing the debate about how do we sustainable at least into the foreseeable future, then 4 years or 10 years. So I think that'd be the key finding I'd take from that report. The most important metric, I think we keep coming back to this adjusted underlying result. I'd have a focus in my budget, and I'd want to understand what that looks like as a percentage of my revenue and how that would change over time. I think each council should have targets for that result, as well as they should have targets for indebtedness and asset renewal. And they should set those targets strategically and say, well, what does good look like? What does sustainable look like in 4 years? How far away are we from that? And how over the next 4 years and the 4 budget cycles are we going to get to that? So I think they're the kind of key messages I'd be giving to councillors as they're looking at the budget process.
Yeah. I know a lot of what you do is looking back to see what's happened and interpreting that and then making some level of forecasting. What sort of role do you have in terms of current crisis, fuel crisis? It's coming up in all the reporting that I'm doing from councils right across the country. We know it's going to have an impact on the bottom line, don't we? So is that something that you get involved in or at least have a watching brief on, Andrew?
I think the watching brief is really only contextualised into the audit itself, the financial audit we do each year. When we come in and we'll start our, we're kind of halfway through our interim work at the moment, of course, but during the year, we're looking at risks. When we start the financial audit, what are the risks associated with this entity? And then as risks emerge, the auditors step back and say, well, how is this new risk that's now emerged, how is it going to impact on my financial audit? What's it likely to do to the numbers? What's my expectation of the numbers? That's probably as far as we'd go in terms of the audit space. We're certainly not into the advisory space or consulting space, and we're not into prognostications about what may happen or what as I said earlier, I'm kind of disbarred statutorily from questioning the merits of policy objectives of councils. So I'd be loath to actually start stepping in and saying, well, I think you need to tweak that number or that number. So we'll take it from, we'll sit back and say, well, how does this change the risk in the financial audit and in terms of financial reporting?
Yeah. Pretty unique set of circumstances at the moment, isn't it?
Indeed.
Thank you, Andrew, for that clarity. I think that's been a very instructive conversation, and it's a reminder, I think, for everyone in the sector that while the balance sheets might look healthy on the surface, that long-term work of asset management and financial discipline remains as critical as ever. And you can find that full local government audit report on the VLGA website at audit.vic.gov.au. Andrew, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on VLGA Connect.
Always a pleasure, Chris. Thanks very much.
Well, that's just about it for another edition of VLGA Connect. Before we go, a quick reminder about the latest live panel, the VLGA and the LGIU, bringing together another global executive panel. It's happening next Thursday, the 30th of April, 5:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. We have a terrific panel assembling to talk about the evolving nature of local democracy, from core service delivery to broader advocacy. You can find out more about that by heading to the events page of the VLGA website, and that's also where you should register your place so you don't miss out and can be part of that discussion. It's free for members, and it is a small fee for those who are non-members of the VLGA or the LGIU. Look forward to having you with us for that live panel next Thursday. Thanks to Ben Blain and to Andrew Greaves, our guests this week on VLGA Connect. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you again for more next week. Until then, bye for now.